In the heart of Chicago, where the pulse of the city thrummed with life and energy, there stood a relic of another time, St. Elias Church. Once a sanctuary for the faithful, its towering spires and grand stained glass windows had long since lost their luster, now hidden behind layers of grime and neglect. The church, once a beacon of hope, had become an object of fear, shrouded in mystery and the whispers of the dark deeds that had taken place within its walls. The stories surrounding St. Elias were as old as the church itself. Built in the late 1800s, it was said to be one of the most beautiful buildings in the city, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture. But over the years, as the city grew and the faithful dwindled, the church fell into disrepair. By the 1950s, it had been abandoned, left to the mercy of the elements and the passage of time. Yet, it wasn't the decay of brick and mortar that kept people away. It was something far more sinister. Local legends spoke of a satanic cult that had claimed the church as their own shortly after it was abandoned. According to the stories, the cult performed gruesome rituals in the crypt beneath the church, offering sacrifices to dark forces in exchange for power and eternal life. The police had investigated rumors of these rituals several times over the decades, but nothing was ever found. No bodies, no evidence, just the persistent whispers of those who claimed to have seen things they could not explain. These tales were what drew Jacob Harris to the church on that chilly October evening. Jacob, a journalist with a taste for the macabre, had built a career on uncovering the secrets that others were too afraid to confront. He had a knack for finding stories in the darkest corners of the world, and St. Elias was a challenge he couldn't resist. Jacob wasn't alone on this expedition. His girlfriend, Sarah Mitchell, was with him, an aspiring photographer who shared his fascination with the supernatural. She had a sharp eye for detail and a fearlessness that matched his own, making them a formidable team. Along with Sarah, 3 of their friends had agreed to join them. Mike, a skeptical history professor who viewed the trip as little more than a joke. Lisa, an adrenaline junkie always on the lookout for her next thrill. And Tom, the quiet one of the group, who often followed along simply because he enjoyed the company. The 5 of them stood before the imposing facade of St. Elias, its weathered stone walls looming over them like a silent sentinel. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the churchyard, and the air was thick with the scent of rain. "Are you sure about this, Jacob?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with excitement and a hint of nervousness. Jacob grinned, his eyes alight with the thrill of the unknown. "Absolutely. This place is a gold mine of untold stories. Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" Mike chuckled, shaking his head. "Famous last words, Jacob. You know this is all just a bunch of nonsense, right? Urban legends, stories told by people with overactive imaginations." "Maybe," Jacob replied, "but aren't you curious? Don't you want to know if there's any truth to the rumors?" Mike shrugged. "I'll admit I'm curious, but I'm not expecting to find much more than a few creepy old rooms and maybe some rats." With that, they pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the church. The hinges groaned in protest, and the sound echoed through the vast, empty space within. The interior of St. Elias was a stark contrast to its once glorious past. The pews were covered in dust, and the altar was draped in cobwebs. The stained glass windows, once vibrant with color, were now dull and cracked, allowing only slivers of the dying light to filter through. "Creepy," Lisa muttered, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. This place looks like it's straight out of a horror movie. Perfect, isn't it? Jacob said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. He pulled out his flashlight and motioned for the others to follow him toward the back of the church. The entrance to the crypt should be this way. They moved cautiously through the church, the silence pressing in on them like a physical weight. As they neared the altar, Jacob found what he was looking for, a narrow staircase leading down into the depths of the church. The steps were worn, almost smooth from years of use, and the air that wafted up from below was cold and damp, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. "One last chance to back out," Jacob said, his tone half joking. But when no one moved, he nodded and led the way down the stairs. The crypt was colder than any of them had expected, the kind of cold that seeped into their bones and made them shiver despite their warm clothes. Their footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and the sound seemed to linger in the air, as if reluctant to leave. The group moved in a tight cluster, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, revealing glimpses of old tombs and faded carvings. "This place is ancient," Sarah whispered, her voice reverberating softly. "I wonder how many people were buried down here." "Too many to count, I'm sure," Tom replied quietly, his eyes darting around nervously. They reached the center of the crypt, where a stone altar stood, its surface covered in strange, faded symbols that none of them could decipher. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very walls were watching them, waiting for something to happen. Jacob set the Ouija board on the altar, the planchette placed carefully in the center. He looked at his friends, his expression serious now. "All right, let's do this." They gathered around the board, placing their fingers on the planchette. For a moment, nothing happened, and then, ever so slowly, it began to move. The tension in the air was palpable as the planchette spelled out the first word, Hello. A nervous laugh escaped Lisa. "Okay, that's freaky. Who's moving it?" "I'm not," Mike said, his voice low. "Neither am I," Tom added, his eyes wide. The planchette continued to move, picking up speed, the words forming faster and faster. Hyareyouhere. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Maybe we should stop," Sarah suggested, but Jacob shook his head. "Not yet," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ask it something else." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "What do you want?" The planchette paused for a long moment before slowly spelling out a single word, Sacrifice. The cold in the crypt was relentless, biting into their skin and settling deep into their bones as the group huddled around the stone altar. The air felt thicker down here, saturated with the weight of centuries of secrets, the remnants of rituals long forgotten by time, but not by the place itself. The walls, covered in dampness and streaked with mold, seemed to close in on them, narrowing as if the crypt itself was alive and aware of their presence. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the Ouija board, the planchette still resting on the word it had just spelled, Sacrifice. The gravity of the situation began to settle over him, smothering the thrill that had driven him to this moment. He had sought out the church for a story, a brush with the supernatural that he could write off as just another urban legend. But now, standing here in the icy grip of the crypt, surrounded by the thick silence of the dead, the fear was real, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. "We should leave," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched her camera like a lifeline. "This isn't right, Jacob. Something's wrong." "Yeah," Tom agreed, his usual calm demeanor shattered by the creeping terror. He kept glancing over his shoulder, eyes wide, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "I don't think we should be here. Let's just go. Now." But the door at the top of the crypt stairs had slammed shut, and though Mike and Lisa had tried with all their strength, it wouldn't budge. The door was as solid as the stone around them, sealing them in with an ominous finality. Now, the group was trapped, and panic was beginning to take hold. "Jacob, what do we do?" Lisa's voice broke the uneasy silence, rising with fear. She was the bravest among them, the one always chasing the next thrill, but even she was rattled by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Jacob swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had no answers, no plan for what to do if things went wrong. It had all seemed like a game until now, a harmless exploration, a chance to poke fun at ghost stories. But there was no denying that something was happening, something beyond their understanding. I don't know," Jacob finally admitted, his voice strained. He hated the helplessness in his tone, the realization that he had led his friends into something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. "We need to stay calm. There has to be a way out. Maybe it's some kind of trick." "A trick?" Mike snapped, his usual skepticism tinged with desperation. "This isn't a joke, Jacob. We're locked in a goddamn crypt, and that board just told us it wants a sacrifice. How is that a trick?" Before Jacob could respond, the temperature in the crypt plummeted further, the cold now unbearable. Their breath hung in the air, visible in the faint light, and a deep, resonant hum filled the space. It wasn't a sound exactly, but more of a vibration, a low-frequency thrum that they could feel in their chests, rattling their bones. The shadows in the corners of the crypt seemed to move, coalescing into forms that slithered along the walls, flickering just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Panic seized them, paralyzing their limbs as the humming grew louder, vibrating the stone beneath their feet. The sound was everywhere, surrounding them, drowning out their frantic thoughts. "Do you hear that?" Sarah's voice was barely audible over the noise, her wide eyes searching the darkness. "It's coming from the walls," Tom whispered, pressing himself closer to the others, his knuckles white as he gripped his flashlight. "It's like something's trying to get in or out." The Ouija board on the altar began to move again, the planchette jerking violently across the board as if controlled by an unseen hand. It moved faster and faster, spelling out words they couldn't follow, until finally it stopped on a single word centered on the board. BLOOD. A sharp, metallic scent filled the air, and Sarah gasped as she noticed a thin trickle of blood running from her nose. She wiped it away with trembling fingers, only to see the same happening to the others, small rivulets of blood trailing from their nostrils, from tiny cuts on their hands, from nowhere at all. The crypt seemed to pulse, the walls contracting with each beat of their collective hearts, as if the church itself was feeding on their fear, on their very life force. "We have to do something," Lisa shouted, her voice panicked. "We have to get out of here." But the crypt held them fast, a cage of stone and shadow that offered no escape. The humming grew louder still, now a roar in their ears, disorienting and overpowering. The shadows along the walls twisted and writhed, forming into shapes that were almost human, but not quite. They moved with unnatural fluidity, dark figures that seemed to melt in and out of the stone, coming closer with each passing moment. "What the hell are those?" Mike asked, his voice shaking as he pointed at the shifting forms. "What are we dealing with, Jacob?" Jacob didn't have an answer. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin, fear clawing at his insides. This was supposed to be an adventure, a thrill, but now it was spiraling out of control. Desperation took hold as he looked around at his friends, each of them standing on the edge of panic. "We have to calm down," Jacob said, though his own voice wavered. "This might be some kind of hallucination. Maybe we inhaled something." "Are you serious?" Tom interrupted, his voice tinged with disbelief and anger. "We're bleeding, Jacob. There's something here with us. We need to get out of here before—" His words were cut off by a sudden, violent convulsion. Tom's body jerked as if struck by an invisible force, his eyes rolling back in his head. He collapsed to the ground, writhing as his limbs twisted in unnatural angles. The others backed away in horror, too stunned to move, to help. Tom, what's happening?" Sarah screamed, but her voice was lost in the cacophony. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Tom's convulsing form, and in a flash he was gone, dragged into the darkness by the unseen force. His screams echoed through the crypt, mingling with the roaring hum. And then, silence. The place where he had lain was empty, the only sign of him a smear of blood on the cold stone floor. No, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be happening. It can't be real." But the terror was undeniable. The reality of the situation sinking in as they realized that whatever they had unleashed was not going to stop until it had claimed them all. The shadows were growing thicker, more defined, creeping closer with each passing second. Jacob grabbed Sarah's hand, his grip tight, as he tried to pull her away from the altar. "We need to move now," he shouted over the deafening noise. "Stick together. Don't let it separate us." They started to run, but it was too late. The crypt, once just a dark and eerie place, was now a nightmare of living shadows and echoes of ancient evil. The walls closed in, the air thick with the stench of blood and decay. The shadows reached out with tendrils of darkness, snatching at their clothes, their skin, pulling them back toward the altar. Mike was the next to fall, his flashlight clattering to the ground as the shadows consumed him, pulling him into the blackness. His screams were cut short, leaving the others paralyzed with terror. Lisa and Sarah clung to each other, their backs pressed against the cold stone of the crypt wall as Jacob fought to keep them together. But the force pulling them apart was too strong, too overwhelming. Lisa's grip on Sarah slipped, and in an instant she was gone, swallowed by the dark. Now only Jacob and Sarah remained, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they stood back to back, the shadows circling them like predators closing in on their prey. The humming had become a deafening roar, vibrating through their bodies, threatening to tear them apart. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking with guilt and fear. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Jacob." Sarah's voice was soft, barely audible over the noise. "What's happening to us?" But before Jacob could answer, the darkness surged forward one last time, wrapping around them both in a crushing embrace. The last thing Jacob saw before he was dragged into the abyss was Sarah's terrified face, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. And then there was nothing. The crypt was silent once more, the shadows retreating into the corners, leaving no trace of the group that had dared to disturb the darkness. The Ouija board sat on the altar, the planchette resting on the word BLOOD, as if waiting for the next set of curious souls to play the game. Outside, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the crumbling walls of St. Elias Church. The city of Chicago awoke, unaware of the horrors that had transpired in the forgotten crypt below. Detective Emily Carson stood at the edge of the churchyard, her eyes locked on the decaying structure of St. Elias Church. It loomed like a specter in the pale morning light, its once majestic architecture now a crumbling testament to the passage of time. The wind whistled through the broken stained glass windows, carrying with it the faint scent of rot and the echoes of a past long buried. Emily had seen her share of grisly crime scenes in her years with the Chicago Police Department, but something about this place set her on edge. Maybe it was the unsettling silence that seemed to hang over the area, or the way the air felt just a bit too cold, even for an autumn morning. She couldn't shake the feeling that St. Elias was more than just another abandoned building. It was a place where dark things had happened, things that defied logic and reason. The call had come in just after dawn. A group of thrill seekers reported missing by their families had last been seen entering the old church. Emily had been assigned to the case, though she wasn't sure why. Missing persons cases usually didn't fall under her jurisdiction. But as she approached the church, the knot of dread in her stomach told her there was more to this than just a simple disappearance. She wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. As a detective, Emily was trained to rely on facts, evidence, and logic. But as she crossed the threshold into the church, she couldn't help but feel that she was walking into something far more sinister than anything she had encountered before. The interior of St. Elias was just as she had expected, dark, cold, and decrepit. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the beams of light that filtered through the cracked windows. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she made her way deeper into the church, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The pews were still there, though most were rotted through, and the altar was draped in a thick layer of dust, untouched for decades. Emily's eyes were drawn to a staircase at the back of the church, partially hidden by the shadows. The reports had mentioned a crypt beneath the church, and she had no doubt that was where the missing group had gone. She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the banister, before starting her descent into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step she took, the temperature dropping noticeably as she entered the crypt. It was like stepping into another world, a place where time stood still and the living had no business being. Her flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing rows of old tombs, their inscriptions faded and unreadable. The damp stone walls seemed to close in on her, the silence pressing against her ears like a physical weight. At the center of the crypt, Emily found what she had been looking for. The Ouija board sat on a stone altar, its planchette resting in the center. There was no sign of the missing group, no blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate what had happened to them. Just the board, as if it were waiting for her to make the next move. Emily frowned, her instincts screaming at her that something was very wrong. She had expected to find clues, evidence of foul play, but instead there was only this. An old game surrounded by an aura of unease that set her teeth on edge. She knelt beside the altar, studying the board closely. It was old, the wood worn and splintered, the letters and numbers faded. But there was something else, too, a fresh message carved into the wood with an unsettling precision. "Thank you." The word sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't explain it, but there was a finality to the message that unsettled her, as if whatever had happened here was done, complete, and there was nothing left to find. But Emily was not one to give up easily. She pulled out her phone and took several photos of the board, the altar, and the surrounding area, careful to document everything. She had a nagging feeling that she would need these later, though she couldn't yet say why. Her investigation took her through the rest of the crypt, but there was nothing else to find. The walls were bare, the tombs untouched. There were no hidden passages, no secret doors, nothing but the oppressive cold and the lingering sense of dread. Frustrated, Emily made her way back to the church above, her mind racing with questions. Back in the daylight, the church seemed less threatening, but the unease remained. Emily pulled out her notebook and began jotting down her thoughts, trying to make sense of the situation. The missing group was just the latest in a series of strange disappearances linked to St. Elias, stretching back decades. And each time the church had been searched, investigated, and yet no evidence had ever been found. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, just people who had vanished without a trace. As she pieced together the information, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Every 50 years, like clockwork, there were reports of people going missing in or around the church. And each time the investigation hit a dead end, with no answers and no closure for the families left behind. The last cycle had been in the 1970s, and now, 50 years later, it was happening again. The more Emily delved into the history of the church, the more she realized that this was no ordinary case. She reached out to local historians, scoured the archives for old police reports, and interviewed anyone who might know something about St. Elias and its dark past. But the deeper she dug, the more she uncovered stories of cults, sacrifices, and strange rituals that seemed to be linked to the disappearances. Yet every lead brought her to the same dead end, an impenetrable wall of silence, fear, and unanswered questions. It was as if the church itself was conspiring to keep its secrets buried, resisting any attempt to bring the truth to light. Despite the mounting evidence of something supernatural at play, Emily refused to let go of her rationality. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain grounded, to separate fact from fiction. But the inexplicable events surrounding St. Elias were testing her resolve. Strange occurrences began to plague her, unexplained noises in her apartment, the feeling of being watched, and cold spots that seemed to follow her wherever she went. At first, she dismissed them as stress, a result of her deepening obsession with the case, but the incidents became harder to ignore. One night, as she sat alone in her office, poring over old case files, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, her breath visible in the frigid air. The lights flickered, casting the room in and out of shadow, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye, a dark shape just out of sight, watching her. Emily whipped around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced as she tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The presence she had felt in the church was following her, reaching out from the shadows, drawing her closer to the truth, and the danger that came with it. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Emily decided to return to the church. She had to face whatever was there, confront the darkness head-on. It was the only way to find answers, to bring closure to the families of the missing, and to put an end to the cycle of disappearances that had plagued Saint Elias for over a century. But as she prepared to go back to the church, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. That whatever lurked in the shadows of Saint Elias was waiting for her, just as it had waited for the others. Emily had always believed in the power of logic and reason, but as she stepped once more into the decaying church, she couldn't help but wonder if those things would be enough to save her from the darkness that awaited. The night was blacker than ink, as Detective Emily Carson made her way back to St. Elias Church, the decaying structure looming like a specter against the stormy sky. The wind howled through the empty streets, driving sheets of cold rain against her face as she approached the gates. Each step was heavier than the last, weighed down by the knowledge that this night would end in either triumph or tragedy. The churchyard was a sea of shadows, the old gravestones jutting out like jagged teeth. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with anticipation and the stench of rot. She clutched the small bag at her side, a collection of protective symbols and ancient rites she had researched in the days leading up to this moment. It felt like a flimsy defense against the malevolence she was about to face, but it was all she had. Emily knew she wasn't just confronting a killer tonight. She was facing something far older, far darker. The weight of the past 100 years hung heavy on her shoulders, the echoes of the missing and the dead calling to her from the darkness. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave this cursed place behind and never look back. But she had come too far, sacrificed too much. If she didn't end it here, the cycle would continue, and more innocent lives would be lost. She reached the church's entrance, the massive wooden doors looming above her, their surface scarred with age. With a deep breath, she pushed them open, the creak of the ancient hinges echoing through the empty nave. The interior of the church was as cold and desolate as she remembered, the faint light from her flashlight casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something foul, like the breath of decay itself. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she crossed the threshold, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that made her flinch. There was no turning back now. She steeled herself, gripping the flashlight tighter as she made her way to the crypt. The stairs descended into the darkness, and as she took the first step, the familiar cold crept over her, seeping into her bones. The crypt was waiting for her, just as it had been before, cold, silent, and full of shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. But something was different now. The air felt charged, vibrating with a dark energy that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The walls seemed to close in around her, narrowing as she approached the center of the crypt where the stone altar stood. And there, at the center of it all, was the Ouija board. The same board that had lured Jacob and his friends to their doom, that had whispered its dark secrets to the countless souls who had dared to disturb it. The planchette sat on the board, unmoving, as if waiting for her to make the first move. Emily swallowed hard, the weight of her task pressing down on her. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for, the final confrontation with whatever dark force had claimed St. Elias as its own. She set down her bag and pulled out the items she had brought, a vial of holy water, a silver crucifix, and a book of ancient rites she had copied from an old grimoire. They were tools, nothing more, but they gave her a semblance of control over the uncontrollable. She approached the altar, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the book and began to read. The words were in Latin, the language of old rituals and forgotten prayers, and she spoke them with a confidence she didn't truly feel. The air around her seemed to thicken as she chanted, the shadows quivering in response, as if the very fabric of the crypt was reacting to her presence. But as the words left her lips, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the crypt, sending a jolt of fear down her spine. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, a mocking, malevolent chuckle that reverberated off the stone walls and filled the space with an oppressive dread. "So, you've come to play, little detective." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to seep from the very walls. "You think your little trinkets and words can stop me? You are as foolish as the others." Emily's heart raced, but she forced herself to continue the ritual, her voice trembling only slightly as she recited the ancient words. She knew better than to engage with whatever was speaking to her, acknowledging it would only give it more power. But the voice wasn't easily ignored. "Do you think you're different?" it taunted, the shadows around her growing darker, more substantial. "You think you're stronger, smarter. You're just another offering, another sacrifice. The church demands blood, and it will have yours." The planchette on the Ouija board began to move on its own, scraping across the wood with a grating sound that set Emily's teeth on edge. It spelled out a single word over and over, B-L-O-O-D. Emily's voice wavered as the cold intensified, the temperature dropping so low that her breath hung in the air in thick clouds. The shadows surged forward, swirling around her like a storm, blocking out the light from her flashlight and plunging her into darkness. She could feel them pressing in on her, suffocating, pulling at her from all sides. Her heart pounded, a drumbeat of fear that echoed in her ears. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Emily forced herself to continue, her voice rising above the roar of the shadows. She raised the crucifix, pressing it against the Ouija board, and splashed the holy water across the altar. The air sizzled where the water touched, and the shadows recoiled with a hiss, momentarily retreating. "You think you can banish me?" The voice snarled, more vicious now, laced with fury. "I am eternal. I am the darkness that lives in all men's hearts. You cannot kill what was never alive." Emily felt the ground beneath her tremble, the stone floor cracking as the crypt seemed to buckle under the weight of the dark force. The shadows gathered themselves, forming into a shape, a figure of pure darkness with eyes like burning coals that glared at her with unbridled hatred. It towered over her, a manifestation of everything evil that had ever touched St. Elias. But Emily stood her ground. She was terrified, her body trembling with the effort of holding herself together, but she refused to back down. She raised the book, chanting louder now, her voice carrying through the crypt like a clarion call. The figure snarled, its form flickering as the words struck it, but it did not retreat. "You will fall," the voice hissed, the figure advancing on her, its eyes burning with an infernal light. "You will join the others, your soul trapped here forever, feeding me for all eternity." The ground shook harder, the walls cracking as the crypt began to collapse around them. But Emily didn't stop. She poured every ounce of her will, her fear, and her anger into the words, her voice rising to a shout as she completed the ritual. The figure let out a roar of rage, its form disintegrating into a mass of shadows that swirled violently around the crypt, tearing at the walls, the ceiling, everything in its path. And then, with one final ear-splitting scream, the shadows were gone. The crypt was plunged into silence. The oppressive weight lifted as the dark presence vanished. The air was still, the temperature slowly rising as the normal sounds of the night began to filter in from outside. Emily collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had broken the hold the church had over the darkness. The ritual was complete, the cycle broken. But as she knelt there in the silence, the enormity of what she had just faced began to settle over her. She had been moments away from death, from joining the countless souls who had been claimed by the church before her. But she had survived. She had won. The crypt, now eerily silent, began to crumble. The ground beneath her feet shook as the ceiling cracked and fell in pieces. Emily knew she had to leave before the entire structure came down on top of her. Summoning the last of her strength, she forced herself to stand and stumbled toward the stairs, her body aching with every step. She emerged from the crypt just as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the ruined church. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and cold, but clean, free of the dark energy that had suffused it. The church behind her groaned as it began to collapse, the ancient stone giving way at last, burying the crypt and its secrets beneath tons of rubble. Emily watched as the building came down, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The nightmare was finally over. The church was no more, and with it, the evil that had claimed so many lives. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye in the debris, a flash of wood untouched by the destruction. She froze, her heart skipping a beat as she approached the pile of rubble, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. There, half buried in the rubble, was the Ouija board. It was intact, unmarred by the collapse, its surface gleaming in the dawn light. And on it, the planchette rested in the center, as if waiting for the next hand to touch it. A single word was carved into the wood, fresh and sharp: soon. Emily's blood ran cold as she stared at the board, the finality of the message sinking in. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The darkness had been banished, but it wasn't gone. It would wait, as it always had, for the next soul to wander into its grasp. With a shudder, Emily turned away from the board and walked into the rising sun, her mind already turning to the future. She had survived this night, but she knew, deep down, that the darkness would return. And when it did, she would be ready. The church was gone, the crypt buried, but the evil it housed was not so easily destroyed. It was patient, eternal, and it would rise again. But so would she.